Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. I hope you were all able to check out the episode of Once Upon a Nightmare I featured last week. If you missed it, I guest hosted and we discussed the 2006 film Carla. This week, I'm back to being solo and true crime. We've all heard the expression, they must be drinking the Kool-Aid, referring to someone following an idea or preference due to popularity or persuasion. The saying originated from the cult following of Reverend Jim Jones and the People's Temple. He led his followers to a revolutionary suicide by drinking Kool-Aid laced with cyanide. But was it really a group suicide or a mass murder? I recently listened to a podcast covering Heaven's Gate. Their followers believed God is an alien. Together, they abandoned their human bodies, as in killed themselves, to spiritually board a spaceship that would take them to the next level, aka heaven. I find these religious cults fascinating. Not like I want to be a member, but fascinating as in I need to understand how educated human beings can believe such things. Anyways, Heaven's Gate will be a whole nother episode. Today, I'm talking about religious cult leader James Jones Jr., who went by Jim. Let's get a little background and find out how he became the leader of the People's Temple. Jim was born May 13th, 1931 in the rural town of Crete, Indiana. During his birth, his mother Lynetta nearly died and had a vision. In this vision, she was visited by her late mother who predicted her newborn son was going to be a great man. Lynetta wasn't much of a motherly woman. She didn't even want children, but she felt some comfort knowing her son was destined to be something special. Jim grew up during the Great Depression, and the Jones family suffered quite a bit financially. James Sr. was a World War I vet who experienced a mustard gas attack during active duty. Because of this, he suffered breathing complications and struggled to hold a job. He could barely speak more than a few words at a time. In 1934, they were evicted from their family home because of multiple missed mortgage payments. Relatives didn't want to see them homeless and purchased a small home in the neighboring town of Lynn. This shack didn't have electricity or plumbing. This is where Jim spent his childhood and adolescent years. The family tried to make a living by farming, but due to James's medical conditions, that wasn't profitable either. They struggled to keep food on the table. Sometimes they were forced to forage the surrounding woods for food. Since James was not able to work, Lynetta did what she could to provide. Toddler Jim was left home alone with his father, who paid no attention to him. He basically raised himself. As early as elementary school, Jim was showing a lack of respect for authority. He was quite the troublemaker. Having said that, his teachers say he was very smart, gifted even. He had trouble making friends, leaving him as lonely at school as he was at home. He had this to say about his childhood, quote, "I was ready to kill by the end of the 3rd grade. I was so aggressive and hostile, I was ready to kill. Nobody gave me love and understanding. In those days, a parent was supposed to go with a child to school functions. There was some kind of school performance, and everybody's parent was there but mine. I'm standing there alone." When he was 10 years old, a local woman took pity on the lonely boy and invited him to join her at the local Pentecostal church. He said it was the first time he ever felt accepted or loved. The members of the church became his new family. Lynetta and James did not attend church. Lynetta believed in spirits and reincarnation, but did not believe there was a God. Jim's main interests became religion and politics. He studied influential leaders and dictators, and not just the good ones, everyone from Gandhi to Hitler. He began piecing together a plan for an ideal society. In the 1940s, a teenage Jim Jones started hosting small church services in the loft above his parents' garage. He called it God's House. The weird thing was that once he started his sermon, he locked his guests inside and did not allow them to leave until he was finished. One night, Donald, a friend who was attending, was ready to go home. Jim's services would sometimes go on and on late into the night. Donald found a way out of the loft, and as he walked away, he heard Jim yell from the garage. He was pointing a gun at him and said, "Just stop, or I'll shoot ya." Donald called his bluff and kept walking. Jim fired the gun, barely missing him. He had a lot of pent-up anger from feeling so neglected his entire life, and obviously dealt with that anger in unhealthy ways. One thing I will admit, I admire that Jim felt strongly about equality for gender, race, and age. He regularly preached against racial segregation. And at this time, segregation was still the norm. He wasn't scared to stand up for what he believed in. He played basketball in high school, but quit after his coach made racist comments. Once he was in line to get a haircut and witnessed the barber refuse to cut a black man's hair, he too got up and left. James Sr. was a Ku Klux Klan member and was enraged to find out what Jim was up to. He let it be known that, quote, people of color were not welcome in his home. After this, Jim never spoke to his father again. James and Lynetta eventually divorced. Jim moved with Lynetta to Richmond, Indiana. Richmond was also racially segregated, so Jim got right down to business trying to change that. As a senior in high school, he worked part-time as an orderly at Reed Hospital, and this is where he met Marceline Baldwin. She was a nurse in training and was instantly drawn to Jim. He seemed wise beyond his years and was empathetic with the parents and their families. After high school graduation, Jim attended Indiana University, Bloomington, with the ambition of becoming a doctor. That was until Eleanor Roosevelt gave a speech about her disapproval for segregation and racism. This felt like his calling. He did not finish the program and decided to focus on radical politics. Jim and Marceline dated through his college years and married in 1949. Jim was 18 and Marceline 22. She grew up Methodist, and the couple frequently argued about religion. At this point in time, Jim identified as agnostic. He didn't deny there was a God, he just didn't worship him in any one set religion. The Methodist Church still practiced segregation and did not believe in interracial relationships. It was viewed as unchristian. I guess they found a compromise, attending the Methodist Church service on Sunday mornings and the Pentecostal church on Sunday evenings. Despite Marceline's Methodist beliefs, the couple started adopting children into what they called their rainbow family. Their first adoption was in 1954, a Native American girl named Agnes. Their next 3 children, Lou, Suzanne, and Stephanie, were Korean American and adopted in 1959. Sadly, not long after, 5-year-old Stephanie died in a car accident. Later that same year, 1959, Jim and Marceline had their only biological child, Stephen Gandhi. And in 1961, they adopted an African-American baby boy that they named James III. There were whispers everywhere they went. One lady actually spat on Marceline as she walked by holding baby James. Marceline wanted to move somewhere that they would feel more accepted, but Jim felt that the children needed to experience this to understand what he was trying to accomplish. He worked hard to racially integrate many different churches, restaurants, and places of business in Bloomington. In 1951, the family moved to Indianapolis, Indiana. Jim finished his degree in secondary education and joined a Communist Party. His attendance at the communist gatherings caused further harassment for Jim and his family. Even though Jim saw himself more as a socialist, he saw a lot of similarities in communism. He decided to become a Methodist minister in an attempt to implement his own beliefs. He was fired from the position after being caught stealing money from the church. Although, if you asked him, he left on his own accord because the white members weren't accepting of his racial integration. He was finally properly ordained as a minister. The now Reverend Jim Jones started his own church called Community Unity. He went door to door inviting people from all walks of life to the first interracial church in town. He began implementing practices he picked up from Father Divine, leader of the Peace Mission in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Father Divine believed he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Therefore, his followers hung on every word. Members of the Peace Mission lived in a commune and followed a set of strict rules. Jim needed his members to believe he was something special, a messiah. So he began performing spiritual healings. At first, this was just to gain followers, but he quickly realized this was also a moneymaker. What is a spiritual healing, you ask? Well, Reverend Jim Jones would simply touch a person and heal all their ailments, including cancer. But he had no such powers. It was all a facade. One of his favorite healing performances was that of his secretary, although no one knew it was his secretary. She sat in the audience in a wheelchair, pretending to be crippled and unable to walk on her own. She was called forth by Reverend Jones. She shook her head no. Then he walked over and put his hand on her, blessing her. Then, one step at a time, she stood up and walked. The whole room rejoiced in the miracle performed by the almighty Reverend Jim Jones. Jim and his staff would eavesdrop on his members, discovering their medical issues so they could be called forward during his services and healed. He even went as far as digging through their garbage to collect information like what they ate and what medications they took. Of course, they weren't actually healed, but endorphins can give a placebo effect. Remember how earlier I stated he even claimed to cure cancer? Jim had a bag of cancerous lumps he supposedly removed from people during healings. It was actually just a bag of chicken gizzards, which is freaking disgusting. His healing performances made him so popular that he moved to a larger church building and renamed it People's Temple Full Gospel Church. He wasn't stupid, though. He saved the healings for the very tail end of his sermons, meaning the members of the People's Temple had to sit through the entire service first. Here is where things get extra effed up. Those who openly questioned Jim Jones' abilities were secretly drugged and dropped over dead during service. But they didn't really die, they just passed out. Then Jim would perform a healing to resurrect them, making them and all witnesses true believers of his healing powers. One woman passed out and woke up with a cast on her leg. Another source said it was her arm. Either way, they claimed she had fallen and broken a bone, to which Reverend Jim Jones later miraculously healed. Jim didn't believe there should be rich or poor people. He advised his followers to donate their possessions so all could be equal, and they did. But he failed to tell them that he was lining his pockets with thousands of dollars from offerings at each service. Jim wanted to create a commune for his members to live, like the Peace Mission in Philadelphia. He read an article written in Esquire called 9 Places to Hide. It was about areas that were likely to survive a nuclear attack, and this was a legitimate fear of Jim's. One of the places on the list was a town in Brazil. Jim and his family temporarily moved there to evaluate if it was a good area to build his commune, but in the end decided that it wasn't. When he returned nearly a year later, the People's Temple was in shambles. Without his healing services, his following dwindled to barely 100 members. Swastikas were painted on the side of the building, and dead animals had been thrown around his yard. But he used this to his advantage. Jim organized racial attacks to show his congregation that Indianapolis was unsafe and they should move to a safer location. The most ridiculous attack happened when a group of temple members were walking through the church parking lot. They heard a loud bang, like a gunshot. They looked over to see Jim clutching his chest and a red circle blooming over his shirt pocket. The members carried him into the church. Jim then asked to be alone, changing his shirt, and exited the building. He had healed himself of a gunshot wound. Jim hung his bloody shirt within the church to remind his followers of the danger they were in. The members never questioned the fact that there wasn't a hole in the shirt, only a red stain. Ukiah, California was another area listed in 9 places to hide. Jim purchased 60 acres of rural land in this California wine country. The beautiful views were enough to encourage some people to join the People's Temple. A fleet of vans drove from Indianapolis to California. 140 of Jim's most loyal followers quit their jobs and made the move. The rest of the congregation stayed behind with his assistant pastor, Russell Winberg. In California, members were given a place to live and fed communal meals. They worked at soup kitchens, free clinics, homeless shelters, and animal rescues. Which sounds great, but all their wages and possessions were then turned over to the church. They were given a $5 allowance per week for necessities. Jim made his followers call him father or dad, and Marceline mother or mom. He increasingly took over the lives of his members. As the parents, Jim and Marceline adopted a Caucasian boy named Tim, whose birth mother was a temple member and unable to care for him. For being all about equality, he was still behind on the times when it came to the gay community. He preached that it was wrong to be gay. Yet, he was arrested and charged for soliciting an undercover male police officer. He was quick to come up with an excuse. He said men could only participate in gay relations if it was with him, so they could connect symbolically. What a load of bullshit. He offered himself up to all members of the community for the same connection, both male and female. And offering himself up might be the wrong way to word it. He actually sought them out, basically rape, because you didn't dare deny the Messiah when he approached you. Oh, and he was simultaneously preaching celibacy to the church. Outside of marriage, you were not permitted to have sex, unless it was with him, of course. 2 members had a long-term affair with Reverend Jim Jones. When Marceline found out, she wanted a divorce. As if a bunch of one-time random sex is okay, but she draws the line when he has sex with the same person over and over. Jim threatened to keep the children from her, so she ultimately stayed. One of the women he was having an affair with, Caroline, became pregnant. To cover it up, Jim sent her on a mission. She returned with a baby and a story about how she was raped during her mission in Mexico. The baby was named Jim John. In the late 1960s, Jones revealed that his religion wasn't about worshiping God, because he considered himself to be God. He was the one performing miracles, after all. But his true intentions had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with socialism. Jones began mocking Christianity as a, quote, flyaway religion. He said the Bible was a tool used to oppress women and non-whites. During a sermon, he threw the Bible across the room. He waited in dramatic silence and said, "See, I wasn't struck by lightning. Too many people are looking at this instead of looking at me." Buses traveled the country to spread the word, perform healings, and recruit new members. Somehow the church, if you can call it that, kept growing. By 1970, he had opened new locations in San Fernando, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And by 1973, the People's Temple had 2,570 members. He moved the headquarters to San Francisco because he found it easier to promote radical politics in the city. To make sure he kept his members, Jim Jones had them sign a blank piece of paper, thinking it was an attendance sheet. But he kept them, and if any members tried to leave, he would write whatever lie felt right above the signature. A confession to adultery, robbery, or even murder. Whatever story could convince the member to stay rather than deal with the consequences of the so-called confession. He bought up every newspaper or magazine in the area with negative press to avoid locals reading it. Jones had been using amphetamines for years to stay alert and upbeat, but it became an addiction that made him paranoid and irrational. A hot topic for his sermons was revolutionary suicide. He stated that they should drive their buses off the Golden Gate Bridge to show the world what they stood for, to challenge the current system. Most members were against this idea, but would never say so out loud. they were beginning to feel trapped. Members were financially bound to the church and threatened if they voiced concerns or opinions that didn't mesh with Jim Jones. One evening, Jones allowed his members to enjoy a glass of wine. Once they had all been served and sipped from their glasses, he made the announcement that they consumed poison. Panic set in for some members. A woman ran to the door to exit and was stopped by Jim's bodyguards. But it turns out that everyone was fine. The wine hadn't been poisoned. It was a test to see who was willing to die and who was unfaithful to him. Those who did want to leave the People's Temple often ended up dead by supposed suicide or an accident. And if these people happened to have children, the welfare checks were made payable to Jim Jones and the People's Temple. How convenient. In late 1973, Jones and his inner circle began a long-term plan to relocate the People's Temple. Ideally, a remote area where they are out of the public eye, and more importantly, unable to escape. They purchased a large agricultural plot of land near Jonestown, Guyana in South America. The plan was to build the commune from the bottom up before moving the members. Fields were cleared for farming, a power system was set in place, and the first few cottages were built. In 1974, Jim Jones and a select few members flew to Guyana and cracked down on creating what would become Jonestown, named after the Messiah himself. But bad press sped up the move. 10 ex-members spilled the beans about life on the commune to a reporter for the New West magazine. The article, titled "Inside the People's Temple," was scheduled to print August 1st, 1977. Jones got wind of the article and decided they needed to move now, like that night. 50 members were sent to Jonestown immediately. It was a disaster. The crops weren't ready for harvest, and providing members with food was a major concern. But Jim consumed things considered luxurious in Guyana, like coffee and meat, while other members starved. Not only that, but there was a lack of medical care. This was the literal jungle. Small cuts became big problems. Mosquito bites led to illness, and forget proper nutrition. But this didn't stop Jones. He would radio members in California, "Things are great, send more people." The dormitories were overpopulated, but that also meant there were more workers to help build Jonestown. By the time 400 members had relocated, there were 6 cottages, a pharmacy, lab, infirmary, playground, basketball court. Things were coming together. Jim went back and forth from Guyana to California. When Jim wasn't there, people actually enjoyed living in Jonestown. But when he was there, everyone was on edge. People thought they were just visiting, months at the most, but little did they know that once they arrived in Jonestown, they would never leave. By 1978, over 900 members resided in Jonestown. Jim spread lies to the members about what was going on in America, reinstatement of slaves, etc. He wanted to make it seem like Jonestown was a much better option. Family and friends of the People's Temple members were concerned, so much so that they formed a group called the Concerned Relatives. They believed members of the People's Temple were being held against their will in Jonestown. The Concerned Relatives pressured the press to publicize its allegations, influencing the federal and state government to launch an official investigation. Meanwhile, back in Guyana, a drug-induced Jim Jones made crazy announcements over a loudspeaker daily. He often said they were under attack, making his followers stay up all night and guard the borders of Jonestown with guns and machetes. But just like back in the States, Jones orchestrated these attacks himself. He had his son go in the woods and fire shots towards the commune to create fear. His amphetamine use had turned into a full-on addiction. His face became swollen, he slurred his words and yelled obscenities. He constantly licked his lips, which is common in drug addicts. He forced his members to participate in what he called white nights. Like the time he made his members believe they drank poisoned wine, he served the entire commune a glass of Kool-Aid. After it was consumed, he announced on the loudspeaker that they had all been poisoned. They should lay down and prepare to sleep forever. Of course, mass hysteria set in, but after some time they realized no one was ill, no one was dying. That's when he jumped back on for that gotcha again moment. Back in California, the concerned relatives were working to lobby members of Congress to actually fly to Guyana and investigate Jonestown. Word reached Jim Jones that Congressman Leo Ryan, a House of Representatives member of the Democrat Party, was planning a trip to see him. Jones announced, quote, "We prefer death to this kind of harassment. If they allowed Ryan and his entourage into Guyana," he said, "it would be a grave mistake." Having said that, he began prepping for Congressman Ryan's arrival. He moved beds so cottages did not appear overcrowded, planned proper meals, and gave strict instructions on how the members should act around their guests. They were to smile, engage in conversation, but keep it short. If anyone asks, they couldn't be happier in Jonestown, and if they were given a free ticket back to America, they wouldn't go. By the time Congressman Ryan arrived, Jonestown really did look like an amazing place to live, a thriving community filled with love and laughter. Along with Ryan were a few members of the concerned relatives and the press. At a reception dinner, Ryan made a speech admitting that he was pleasantly surprised by Jonestown. There were no barbed wire fence holding members there against their will. It seemed like people were free to come and go as they pleased. Which was true, but if members did try to escape, they were shot. And if they somehow made it past the guards, who were off duty during Ryan's visit, they weren't expected to survive long in the jungle. But after dinner, a small piece of paper was given to a reporter and then passed along to Congressman Ryan. He unfolded it to read the message, "Please help us get out of Jonestown." He asked the community who would like to leave. There were 15 members who planned to fly back alongside Ryan the following day. At this time, Jones kept his cool. You want to leave? Then leave. That was that. But their exit did not go smoothly. First, Ryan was nearly stabbed by Temple member Don Sly. They hurried to board the two planes waiting on the airstrip. Armed guards that Jones called the Red Brigade chased them down in a tractor-trailer and surrounded the planes. They began firing at Ryan and his entourage. Congressman Ryan and 4 others died then and there on the airstrip. The 15 members of the People's Temple had already boarded the other plane. But one had ulterior motives. At the instruction of Jim Jones, member Larry Layton last minute joined the group to leave. The others found this very suspicious because he was one of the People's Temple's most loyal followers. But Ryan would not deny anyone the chance to leave. Larry pulled out a gun and began firing at the other members, killing them and NBC cameraman Bob Brown. There were a handful of survivors from those who were attempting to board the plane. They fled to the jungle at the first sound of gunshots. During the attack, the plane that Congressman Ryan was attempting to board took off. Back at the commune, members were unaware of what was happening on the airstrip. But Jim Jones got on his microphone and announced that the betrayal of the century has been committed by those who chose to leave. He said, "Someone on that plane is going to shoot the pilot. I didn't plan it, but I know it's going to happen." Yeah, sure. We better not have any of our children left here because it wouldn't be long before Jonestown would be under attack. The military would arrive in parachutes and kill them all, including their innocent babies. He said it was time. All the white knights had been practiced for this. It was time for the People's Temple to commit revolutionary suicide. One member, Christine Miller, spoke up against Jones. She said, quote, "Well, I don't see it like that. I mean, I feel like as long as there's life, there's hope. That's my faith." She argued that her right as an individual was to choose her future, others the right to choose theirs. Many agreed with Christine, but Jones's inner circle and loyal followers verbally and physically bashed her until Jones spoke up. He commended her for allowing him to see both sides of the problem, which calmed down the angry mob temporarily. She asked about the plan for a mass exodus to Russia. That was always the plan if the People's Temple were in danger. Jones said, "We can make that call to Russia, but I know the answer because I'm the prophet. They won't have us. It's pointless. Suicide is the only option."
What a legacy. What a legacy. But the Red Brigade's the only ones that ever made any sense anyway. They invaded our privacy. They came into our home. They followed us 6,000 miles away. The Red Brigade showed them justice. The congressman's dead. Please get us some medication. It's simple. It's simple. There's no convulsions with it. It's just simple. Just please get it. Before it's too late, the GDF will be here. I tell you, get moving. Get moving. Get moving. Don't be afraid to die. If these people land out here, they'll torture some of our children here. They'll torture our people. They'll torture our seniors. We cannot have this. Are you going to separate yourself from whoever shot the congressman? I don't know who shot him.
Vats filled with grape Kool-Aid were rolled into the pavilion. This time it was laced with cyanide and a cocktail of other sedatives that turned the purple drink brown. Mass hysteria broke out when people realized this wasn't a drill. Jones instructed that the children should go first. His wife, Marceline, disagreed with the decision to kill the children in the commune. She had to be restrained by armed guards. The children's mouths were held open, while other members used a syringe to squirt the drugged Kool-Aid down their throats. The babies screamed and cried as they were forced to ingest the poison. A nurse calmed the mothers by telling them the babies weren't crying because they were in pain, it was because of the bitter taste. Some willingly drank the Kool-Aid, but most were forced. Many of the bodies were found with needle marks on their skin from being injected. The statement that it wouldn't cause convulsions was a lie. Especially in children, it also caused foaming at the mouth. Jones ordered the dying children to be taken out of sight while others consumed their meds. After witnessing this, guess who didn't drink the damn Kool-Aid? Jim Jones. He died of a gunshot wound to the head. Died instantly and felt no pain. A coroner said that it was self-inflicted, but his surviving son Stephen said his father was too much of a coward to shoot himself. He believed Jones instructed someone else to shoot him, or perhaps murdered him. Stephen survived this event because he played basketball for Jonestown. Yes, they had their own basketball team, and they were away in Georgetown for a game when the massacre happened. A total of 85 members survived the event. 909 people died, 304 of which were children, making this the greatest loss of American civilian lives, second now to 9/11. The aerial photos taken from this crime scene are just heartbreaking, a sea of lifeless bodies lying on the ground. The survivors were taken back to Jonestown to help identify the bodies. Of the 909 dead, 234 went unidentified. Sadly, these were mostly children. There was a 45-minute recording of the poisoning process that is now referred to as the death tape. And no, this wasn't mass suicide. Some people did choose to end their lives that day, not all because Jones instructed them to. Some people witnessed their children dying and felt they had nothing left to live for, or that dying would be better than the hell on earth they knew as Jonestown. But don't be fooled. This was murder. At the very minimum, those 304 children murdered. The autopsy confirmed that Jim Jones had toxic doses of pentobarbital, an amount that should be lethal to those without a dependency. If you want a more in-depth telling of this story, I suggest listening to Casefile. Jonestown was covered in Case 60. There are 3 parts, each about an hour long. Very well researched and written. I barely scratched the surface of the hell that Jim Jones put these people through. In my research, I discovered that there's a drama being produced about the massacre called White Night, and it's going to be starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Jim Jones. Super stoked about that. He's such an amazing actor, and I'm curious to see him in this type of role. I do have some shout outs to give. J Large Car 66 gave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. He said, "Glad I found this podcast. As a truck driver, I'm always looking for good podcasts to listen to. I binged the whole thing to catch up. Keep up the good work. P.S. I love your voice." Funny you say that, because I had a comment on YouTube that said, "Your glottal fry makes this video unwatchable. Bye." Of course, I had to Google glottal fry because what normal human knows what the hell that is. But basically, my throat makes a weird noise. Glad my return listeners are able to tune it out. Listener Mel Go also gave me 5 stars, titled "Short but Good." Typically, I tend to avoid true crime podcasts that are under 60 minutes or so because I think they must be leaving out a lot of details. However, I gave this one a try and I'm glad I did. She does a great job on research, and I really enjoy her dry sense of humor and her focus on the victims. Great podcast. It's true. I mean, some stories are worth telling, and they all aren't super long. You don't have a lot of details if it's a small town murder, but they still deserve to be told. Follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at Killer Stories PC. You can write any story suggestions to KillerStoriesPodcast@gmail.com. As always, thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.